So this is my talk, N+1 ways to sync your platform. As again said, I'm Matt Tyler, a principal engineer at Mechanical Rock. So I've spent probably the last 5 years working in fairly large organizations, adopting cloud at various sort of stages, and I've generally been working in platform teams in that time. And this is really a distillation of sort of the key lessons I've learnt over that time. I do think that regardless of whether you're in a large company or even like a startup or something smaller, a bit mid-sized, you're going to get something out of this regardless. So my key lessons are really know your value, know your environment, complement, don't compete, and mandates and missed opportunities. So let's start by what I mean by platform team. I subscribe very much to the team topology sort of definition, which is that a platform team is a grouping of other team types that are providing an internal product to accelerate delivery by streamlined teams. Now, if you haven't read team topologies, that's a rather wordy definition. I would say you can sort of simplify this by sort of saying you've got kind of product feature-related teams, that's sort of what they mean by streamlined, that are building kind of products that you're hoping to sort of sell to consumers. Those are going to generate revenue and hopefully profit. Platform teams, on the other hand, are trying to enable those teams. They're trying to accelerate delivery. They're trying to enable standardization. They're trying to help them work better. The key word there is enablement. Enablement is really the most important thing here. That's where all of the value really is. To sort of illustrate that point, compare something like a cloud migration to looking at it from a development enablement perspective. If you're spending X thousand dollars in the cloud every month, on-premise or even in a different cloud, and you move that somewhere else and you sort of realize some kind of cost saving, okay, great, there is benefit there, but effectively what you can do, how much you generate, how much you save is effectively capped by how much you were spending originally. Whereas if you kind of spin that around to developer enablement, that becomes about reducing time to value. If you know that you can deliver a feature that is going to generate X thousand dollars of revenue a year and you can sort of do that in a year, okay, that's excellent. If you can then compress that time and deliver that quicker, that opens up time and that's potential. That gives you the ability to do other things. It gives you to find other revenue generating opportunities. And even if you did nothing with that additional time, you're still no worse off. But the benefits aren't capped like they are in a situation where you're just looking for cost savings. So are platform teams really that sort of different from streamer time teams? And the answer is, well, yes, but also no. Both face similar challenges. You're trying to create a product that you want people to use that they can get benefit from. You benefit from really strong product management. On the other hand, though, you're also working in the reality that you are effectively in a cost center. And that can come with certain kinds of restrictions. You're also often working internally with different sort of departments that are often going to have conflicting things that they want. Now, if you look at a lot of sort of cloud sort of marketing, they talk about undifferentiated heavy lifting. And, those are the things that you do that don't necessarily impact your business. And there's a big sort of sale on, in the future, everything you're going to write is business logic. And that you could say that a platform team's all of what they do could be effectively undifferentiated heavy lifting. So, why do we still end up having platform teams? So I think we can kind of look at this from two perspectives, one from those engineering teams and one from those of the cloud platform vendor itself. Fundamentally, I see engineering as decision making. What are you kind of going to do to make some kind of result happen? And most of us kind of see this at the start of a project, we're thinking, or very early on in a company, what cloud are you going to use? Serverless, Kubernetes? Are you going to go with fast? Are you going to use containers? What languages, frameworks, test methodologies? Decisions upon decisions. Further from that, every line of code we write is effectively a decision. We are taking something that the business wants to achieve, we are solidifying it somewhere, and that is going to run and it's going to achieve some outcome. Now, if we want to change that decision, someone's got to go back, someone's got to put energy in to basically remove that kind of entropy. Most of us get along in our careers, we build experience and we begin to stop kind of making decisions consciously. We go on autopilot and that's sort of what lets us do more. Could you imagine if every time you were going to make some kind of technical decision, you were going to consult the C&CF landscape, or you were going to crack open all your books, or you were going to check every single AWS service and make sure you were using the right one all the time? The reality is a lot of us tend to follow a whole bunch of rules of thumb to make that decision making a bit easier. Because when we give someone work to do, we're giving them a responsibility. and we want to reduce some kind of decision making. Effectively, if team responsibilities grow without limits, performance then begins to be negatively impacted. So if we want to get teams to deliver software, we're going to have to end up at some point making some sort of decisions for them so that they can focus. So stepping back from that, back to the cloud, talking about undifferentiated heavy lifting, okay, well, let's have a look at this from the cloud vendor view. And this comes down to something I like to refer to as the cloud impedance mismatch. I think we all would love it if we just came to everything and everything just kind of works straight out of the box. But most of us don't have that experience. And I think this comes down to, there's a mismatch in expectations here. The vendor fundamentally is going to want to capture as much market share as possible. They're going to do that by offering highly specialized services to particular kind of verticals, or, as is quite common, they're common sets of kind of components and functionality that we're still required to integrate at some level. So a platform team is basically that mismatch of expectations between the cloud vendor and the consumer. It just happens to have manifested itself inside a team. So I take a very broad view of what I consider sort of a platform team. I think most of us probably have a platform team in our organizations, in our companies, no matter what the size, we're probably just not calling it that. If you have a group of people within your organization that are making decisions about how you use cloud, how you're going to build your software, you have a platform team. You're just not calling it that. I see platform teams as fundamentally performing three key functions, and those are augment, audit, and advise. And augment is probably what we most think about when we think of a platform team. In early versions of kind of this slide deck, I just called augment platform until I found a better A word to use. So augment is effectively like building cross-cutting concerns that you really don't want your stream-aligned teams actually doing. So if you've got a team somewhere within your org that's like managing centralized logging and Elasticsearch, custom messaging queues, whatever, that's basically what I mean by augment. Advise can change a bit depending on how large your company is. If you're in a really small company, there's only a few of you, you could probably pull everyone to a room when you have a problem, you all have a chat, you make a decision, it's done. If you're in a large organization, on the other hand, you probably have things like central architecture teams, or you may have sort of that center of excellence sort of model where you have a group of experts that sort of rotate between teams to try and sort of spread expertise. Extreme examples of audit I find are kind of less common, but you generally see things like linting kind of tools, static analysis, to things like checking your environments is resources that are running your cloud provider are like compliant to some sort of accepted baseline. Probably the easy example of that would be things checking for open S3 buckets. It's pretty normal for things to change over time. You might end up in a situation where a large company gets a whole bunch of outside expertise to come in. That goes on for a few months. They panic that nothing is getting built. They start hiring a lot of people and plowing a lot of money into augmenting and building things. Then they worry that they're running out of cash, and then they sort of switch to sort of audit and advise, and then they sort of meander up into the middle. So for most of this, I'm now going to focus on augment primarily because that's where the things go off the rails. So it's very easy to stop and start auditing something. It's very easy to kind of change your advice. Like building takes investment, it takes cost. So you want to make sure that you're building the right things. So I start by saying, well, look at your company, look at your environment. Some things work in some companies and some don't work in others. I split things into sort of high trust and low trust. So this is going to the basics, how much autonomy your teams are given. And things that kind of affect that might be the size of your company. If you've got a lot of people within there, they might not know you, you might not know them, and it's hard in those cases when you don't have that fundamental trust. Employee turnover effectively has the same kind of result. It could be the age of the company, how much legacy you've got. It could be even down to what industry you're in. If you're heavily regulated, that sort of model tends to filter down into the culture of different teams. So if you're in a high trust organization, it's actually really easy to get things done. You can use use lighter touch controls. You can put templates out. You can put CDK constructs out. You can provide advice. People are going to take it. That doesn't necessarily happen in a low trust environment because they don't trust that you've got their best interests in mind. Likewise, senior management in low trust sort of organisations tend to want the assurances that get given to them by tighter and more stringent controls. So that means that if you're going to go into an org that's low trust and you're hoping to use a lot of really templated approach that people can sort of share around and learn from, what inevitably sort of ends up happening is you end up building sort of the services that are needed to sort of audit and understand that environment and ensure that they are sticking to these baselines. Which sort of brings me to sort of the next point, like effectively then, regardless of whether you sort of pick one of these approaches or the other, low trust environments always sort of tend towards kind of building something. So let's now have a look, like what are the kind of the approaches that I've seen companies take to building things, and fundamentally I see two approaches that really get taken, and those are templated products versus services. So if you're in a company and you've got like a repository sitting around somewhere that's got a load of CloudFormation templates or CDK contracts or Terraform modules or something, that's generally what I mean by templating things. Services are, on the other hand, are where you would be abstracting or actually building some kind of service to provide some kind of function. That's like your managed service that's really only used internally within your company. The big thing that changes between these two things really comes down to, so the key difference between these things is really kind of where operational responsibility ends up lying. In both sort of situations, you generally have a platform or a steward or someone who's looking after these things. But in the templated product case, another team is instantiating those into their accounts. They've effectively got responsibility for running and operating those things. If you're using a service kind of model, that sort of responsibility ends at that service interface, and then the platform team is taking on a lot more of additional responsibility. So effects sort of in the organisation that really this cause really come down to kind of expense and control. Like services are really easy to control. They're expensive to build though. It's a lot easier I actually find it a lot easier to manage versions with services because I've got a lot more control. I'm not necessarily exposing internal detail like I am with a template, which can cause problems. Templates, on the other hand, they're very low cost to distribute to teams. They're very easy to build. The only problem with templates is that people will normally tend to sort of fork them and make these kind of adjustments to them because if they're not meeting their needs, whereas a service, they're kind of stuck. Now that's actually a double-edged sword. Yeah, sure, people are going to make upgrades and changes, and that's great. But if your whole reason kind of for doing this and putting this out is to get some sort of compliance and standardization, you might not actually be meeting those goals. A lot of companies will naively think that they can pump out templates in a repo, people will pull them down, they'll make the adjustments they need, they'll make improvements, and then they'll upstream those changes. And I find the reality is that doesn't always happen. Because your org really needs to, one, it has to give people the time to actually upstream improvements, and two, you really need tight ownership over the particular template itself to ensure that there's some sort of steward there, to ensure that they're maintaining it, they own that, and that that's moving with the organisation's goals. And that doesn't always happen, so it's very important to remember that your organisation's culture is going to interact with your best intentions in ways that you might not have really fully considered. Services, on the other hand, the worst absolute thing that you could probably do with a service is to build something and then spend that investment, spend a couple of years' time, you launch it, cloud vendor releases the same thing pretty much the day after you've done it, and a lot of your effort there is essentially gone. So I think it's actually critical, particularly now, not to try and compete with the cloud vendor and try and think where it's moving. So if you're in a situation where you were deciding to kind of build something, think really hard. If I'm going to spend a couple of years building this, am I going to be able to get that out within that time frame that I think the cloud vendor might release something? Am I going to get it done before then? Am I going to be able to get some kind of value out in between my release and their release? And am I going to be able to switch the guts over that to the managed service to drop my total cost of ownership within sort of a reasonable amount of time? If you can't do that, then, or you don't have the confidence that you can do that, you perhaps shouldn't be building. One thing I say quite often in my teams is the most useful things are not things. So the real value of kind of platform teams really comes with you understanding the different sort of factors that are in your business, the kind of different third-party services you use, and working out how you integrate those things to make that experience for developers a lot more seamless. So the things that I think are actually useful are the things that kind of reflect that. So a lot of us will be in companies that have custom sort of, have their, not custom, sorry, are using like identity management services like Azure AD or Okta or whatever, and those things are probably going to be, might actually be fairly outside of your cloud vendor. So being able to like automate those things, like to reduce dependence on people raising tickets is critically important. Understanding that you need diverse documentation around how your organization builds software. That means that you have frequently asked questions. It means you have tutorials. It means you have technical documentation, because people learn in different ways, and you need to sort of cater to the sheer number of different sort of learning types that you have within your organization. One thing that I found that is absolutely critical is to ensure that you've got face-to-face time, that you've got sort of training events that you can sort of put on, that you can onboard people into, that you can explain how you build things, that you can use to ensure that people know how to interact with the services or the functionality that you are building. Because I think that one thing that gets lost on a lot of people when they go into a platform team and they start building is that nobody is coming into your organization knowing how to use the custom things you built. The reality is most of us are only going to know what's publicly available. Training events are also kind of crucial because they get that face-to-face aspect. So they learn who you are, you learn who they are, you learn to build trust and relationships. Now, another important thing here is that they also learn how to debug. They know where to go when they get stuck. They can come to you, they can go and find the documentation. Because I see a lot of instances where people could clearly get themselves unstuck if they actually knew where to go to look for help. So training is pretty critical. So to me, those are where the value comes from. It doesn't come from building like container orchestrators. It doesn't necessarily come from custom libraries. It doesn't necessarily come from CLI tooling. It comes from all the ways and things you do to try and teach people how your organization works. So now you've gone off and you've built something. Let's say your platform is ready to launch or whatever. So you've got to start getting adoption. Okay. That's simple, right? Like, we've spent a lot of money on this platform, right? Everyone's got to use that. I have never seen a more reliable way to kill an internal platform than to mandate the use of it. And this really runs counterintuitive to what a lot of people think. The reality is when you launch kind of a platform, oftentimes you're not starting out with a particularly mature feature set. Like, you have a lot of legacy in your company that you might have to deal with, that you might want to migrate over on in time. And that takes a while. You are going to have features that clash with features that other teams have built. You are going to have people who have built their own kind of little miniature platforms and are going to interact with what you've built in strange and interesting ways. Secondly, you don't want to end up in a situation where the pace of development on the platform blocks the pace of development in feature teams, because at that point you've lost the ability to enable teams, and it puts you in a very political kind of situation where you'll end up with teams not using the platform or even actively conspiring to kill it. And lastly, and this really should be obvious, but you can't, if you're going to mandate the platform, you can no longer use product adoption to measure the success of your platform, because everybody has to use it. Or you run in situations where people will say they're using it, but they're not actually using it. And that sends up some incentives that aren't great, because if everyone's mandated to use it, you're not really incentivized to actually improve it. So what are kind of some ways to kind of deal with mandates? And one thing I like to talk about is looking at ways that you can drive behavioral change through the platform rather than trying to force people to do things. So this is sort of a scenario I've seen play out. So imagine that you've decided that you have quality problems and that you want everyone to write more tests because that's going to make your quality improve. Maybe it will. Quite often I see the approach that a lot of platforms will initially take with this. Okay, what we'll do is we'll build a kind of a standardized pipeline, we'll put a test stage in there, and we will just force that out to everybody. and it is a terrible idea. For two reasons. One is it ignores the amount of investment that people have made in their existing pipelines, which may be way more complicated than your silly little test stage you've just banged in there. And secondly, it doesn't actually solve the problem. The kinds of teams that are going to avoid writing tests are the kinds of teams that are going to realise that they can just stick a no-op in that stage and continue on as they were doing. So how do you get around that? So the way you to do this is to sort of provide carrots, right? You look for ways that you can encourage that behaviour without sort of forcing anyone to do anything. So you might construct a service that can do test visualization, deliver test reports, deliver coverage reports, etc., like a value add. And then you can provide that and say to your consumers, okay, well, if you just push your test reports up here, we're going to provide that extra and additional value for you. Now, teams still might not care. They might just continue doing on what they're doing. But on the other hand, if they're not hurting anyone and they don't have quality problems, it's probably not an issue. If it really does start to become an issue, then say to team, and teams are actually having clear operational problems, then you can actually start and say, okay, well, we actually provide all of these functionalities and these things to help you build better software. We're not going to release any resources until you actually start using them. And if they do start using them, then you're able to assist them. The other thing is, every now and again, you get stuck making a mandate. That could be because the organisation has got a security configuration that they consider absolutely critical and they want everyone to use it, or it might be because effectively what you are abstracting is so useful and is saving so much time that you have what I like to call an effective mandate, because no one in the right mind is going to spend and waste their time building whatever you're providing. And that's a good situation to be in, but quite often platforms offer a lot of ancillary benefits, a lot of things that supplement and help development. So if you end up in you can end up in a situation there where someone is blocked from basically adopting because something clashes with something, and then they can't get all the other benefits. And that's really not a great place to be in, because then no one can you get stuck. And you'll find, particularly when you're building a new platform, this just happens continuously. So this is really where I recommend you start putting in feature toggles. Now, you wouldn't necessarily tell teams that you have these. You wouldn't necessarily broadcast it. But if a team begins to have issues with something, and security configurations are actually very common for causing this, then you can go out to those teams and say, okay, we understand that you tried to get on, you were having these clashes, we've actually turned this off, try it again. And that's fantastic, because it actually gives you, it doesn't harm your adoption, but it still allows people to come on. Now, you want to eventually fix that issue, but you've bought yourself time. And secondly, you've bought yourself visibility. If you allow someone to go off and it's 6 months time until you get back to them, you might have lost them, and there might have been a whole bunch of other things that have been built, and you've just allowed the problem to compound. So try to avoid mandates if you can, but if you can't, make sure you can turn them off selectively. So that brings me to the end of this. I'm just going to summarise. So first of all, know your value. If you're in a platform team, your job is to enable developers, and if you're not doing that, you're fundamentally not doing your job. Know your environment. Knowing how your company operates, knowing what the culture of your environment is actually critical to knowing what kind of things you can actually use, what tools you can get and you can get success from. Otherwise, you're going to end up copying approaches that you saw off the internet from big company, and they might not help you. Complement, don't compete. So look for opportunities to build things that are unique to how your company operates. If you do that, you avoid the situation where you end up competing with a cloud provider, and that is a competition you just simply aren't going to win. Finally, mandates are missed opportunities. If you can avoid mandating the platform, do it. It's going to incentivize you to actually build better things. Now, if you do get stuck having to make a mandate, make sure that you build in the operational flexibility so that you can actually increase and maintain your adoption. So be a shepherd, not a sergeant. So with that, I'm all wrapped up.